this lecture will be on culture, and in connection to culture, we will be discussing two very significant concepts in the study of ethics, and these are cultural relativism and ethical relativism. So I will focus first on culture. We will define what culture means, and then we will go into each of these notions. Okay. So what is culture? So again, there are two ways to define a term, okay, or a concept. First is to define it etymologically, and then to define it really. So in its etymological definition, that means again, if we study the origin of word culture, okay, culture comes from the Latin verb colere, which means to cultivate or to inhabit or to honor. So that is the root word of the word culture, colere, a Latin infinitive verb, again, which means to cultivate, to inhabit, to honor. And then in its real definition, we have these definitions of culture from various sources. First, culture is a description of a particular way of life which expresses certain meanings and values not only in art and learning, but also in institutions and ordinary behavior. Second, culture is the way of life, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a particular time. So in this real definition, we have the genus of culture. Culture is a way of life. Okay. And specifically, what about this way of life? It is the way of life of a people which expresses certain meanings and values that a group of people upholds. This way of life also manifests general customs and beliefs of a certain group of people. So that is a culture. Okay, so there are a few things that manifest culture. Okay, I will just mention them in passing here. You can study them on your own. So there are different things that manifest culture, or things that show culture, that reveal the culture of a particular group of people. There are symbols, heroes, rituals, and values. Okay, so these four things, they manifest, reveal, or show the culture or the way of life of a people. So we go to this part. What has culture got to do with ethics? So what is the significance of culture? What is the relevance of culture to ethics? Okay, so if we go back to our definition of ethics, so etymologically, if you remember, ethics comes from the Greek word ethos. And again, what does that mean in Greek? It means custom. Okay. On the other hand, okay, a term which is closely related to ethics but has different meaning, morality, comes from the Latin word mores. And in Latin, this word means norms or rules. Okay. Therefore, the use of the terms custom as the root word for customary and norm as the root word for normal lead to an inquiry of what determines the customary and the normal. So in ethics, we deal with things that people customarily do, things that people normally do, what is considered customary and normal for people. So The use of these terms lead us to an inquiry, an investigation of what determines the customary and the normal. What defines the customary and the normal? That which is considered as the customary and the normal is understood as the way of life. Okay? And the way of life is what we call as culture. In other words, the customary and the normal pertain to the culture of a people, or rather, uh, they are they are part of the culture of a people. Okay. This implies that culture has a lot to do with ethics. Okay, so they are closely related, ethics and culture. Okay, because ethics is the study of morality of human actions. Okay, and these human acts are things that people do, the customs of a people. Okay, we can recall that ethics is the study of the morality of human actions. It investigates on what is right and wrong. Okay, that is the primary general definition of ethics. Okay. What makes an action right and what makes an action wrong? What determines right and wrong? Okay, so in our previous lessons, we discussed mga objective, there are objective principles that serve as basis for the morality of human actions. But here we will consider a different perspective. If we admit that a right and wrong are social values that arise from a particular way of life, that is culture, then the values of right and wrong are cultural values. Okay, so right and wrong pertain to the things that people do, to the customs of a people. And the custom of a people again pertain to their culture, their way of life. So therefore, right and wrong are social values because they pertain to the actions of people in society. And therefore, these values are also cultural values. They are embedded in culture, in other words. If there are many cultures, then cultural values may differ from one culture to another. This is called cultural relativism. So we have now this term or notion, cultural relativism. So since there are many cultures in the world, there's, for example, a Western culture. There is an Asian culture, and in specific, there are different cultures in subcultures in these cultures. We have in Asian culture, we have the Filipino culture. So since there are many cultures, cultural values also differ from one culture to another. This is what we call cultural relativism. What is cultural relativism? It is the view that all beliefs, customs, and ethics are relative to the individual within his own culture. Okay. Beliefs, customs, and ethics are relative, or rather are contingent to the individual within his own culture. Okay. Cultural relativism also pertains to the ability to understand a culture on its own terms and not to make judgments using the standards of one's own culture. So cultural relativism rather has a it has a practical objective or goal. It allows a person to understand that a culture um, stands on its own, and therefore it would be improper to judge a culture using the standards of another culture. Okay. The goal here is to promote understanding of cultural practices that are not typically part of one's own culture. So it promotes understanding. It is this kind of practical end of cultural relativism. This perspective leads to the view that no one culture is superior than another culture when compared to systems of morality, law, politics, etc. So all cultures are of equal standing. No culture is superior than another. Okay. That is cultural relativism. Okay, I will skip this one and we will go to the second notion, which is uh, actually derived from the notion of cultural relativism. In other words, they are relative ideas. Since right and wrong are cultural values, and cultural values may vary in its meaning and employment from one culture to another, then the values of right and wrong are relative to the culture to which it is employed. Okay, so we said that right and wrong are cultural values, and that cultural values differ from one culture to another. So then, these values of right and wrong, in their meaning and employment, also vary from one culture to another. So since we are speaking here specifically of ethical values, right and wrong, this will lead us to the notion of ethical relativism. Okay, so the meaning and employment of moral ethical values of right and wrong differ from one culture to another. That is ethical relativism. Okay, and this is a very important concept in the study of ethics. What is ethical relativism? Ethical relativism is the view that states that truth is variable and not absolute. In specific, moral truth. Okay, moral truth is variable and not absolute. What constitutes right and wrong or good and bad is determined solely either by the individual or by society. Okay, so there is no objective and universal basis for right and wrong. Right is determined solely by the individual or society. Since truth is not objective and not universal, there can be no objective standard which applies to all cultures. Okay, so what is right and wrong for this specific culture only operates as right and wrong in that culture. That is the main premise or the main claim of ethical relativism. No one can say if someone else is right or wrong. It is a matter of personal opinion, and no society can pass judgment on another society. In other words, right and wrong are culture specific. What is considered moral in one society may be considered immoral in another. Since no universal standard of morality exists, no one has the right to judge another society's customs. Okay. Right and wrong are culture specific. They are relative or they are contingent to a culture. Okay, so right and wrong are defined by a certain group of people sharing the same culture. Now, ethical relativism has categories or types. Okay. First is subjective ethical relativism. Okay. This is the view that states that the truth of moral principles is relative or contingent to individuals. Okay, so it is the individual person who defines what is right and what is wrong. Okay, or what is good and what is bad. So expressed in other terms, subjective ethical relativism says this: whatever you believe is right for you personally is completely up to you to determine. Okay, this allows a person to be sovereign over the principles that dictate how he should live his life. So it is the person who it is the individual person who is the master. He is the master who determines the principles that dictate himself how he should live his life. That is subjective ethical relativism. Okay, the other one is conventional ethical relativism. This supports the view that the truth of moral principles is relative to cultures or society. So, in a specific culture or in a specific society, there are certain conventions, okay, conventional norms. So, by convention, we mean something that is agreed upon. Okay, so the norms of right and wrong in a specific culture are agreed upon, okay, by the people belonging to that culture. Okay, so right and wrong becomes culture specific. Unlike the subjective view, what is right for you is dependent upon what your particular culture believes is right for you. This view supports the concept that whatever culture says is right for you really is right for you. So it is culture which becomes the highest authority about what is right for each individual within that society. So what has more priority is the will of the cultural majority. It has more priority than the individual's will. That is conventional ethical relativism. So these two are the categories or types of ethical relativism. So when the truth of moral principles is relative to individuals or to the subject, that is subjective ethical relativism. And when the truth of moral principles is determined by a culture or society, that is conventional ethical relativism.